The absolute thirst for new Starfield details continues, and although Bethesda has remained largely quiet, even through their presence at both QuakeCon and Gamescom, we did just get some pretty interesting new details from the game's composer with Anon Zur. This giving us some very interesting new details and descriptions of the game overall that I think some of you are going to absolutely love to hear. And despite Anon's presence at Gamescom, this interview actually just kind of came out of nowhere. It was an interview with the Nikhil Hogan show that up until a few days ago only had a few hundred views, but really gets into the deep cuts of Starfield, and overall the interview is absolutely phenomenal, so I'll have a link to the full thing down below. I'm really only covering the Starfield parts, but we start off with a pretty big quote.
The game is at least twice as big as the biggest game Bethesda ever did.
Starfield being massive isn't exactly shocking. One of the big mic drop moments from the gameplay reveal was of course the presence of 1,000 planets for us to experience, but getting a more concrete size estimation with it being about twice the size of Skyrim or Fallout 4 is pretty exciting. Although I think around this there is still that lingering concern about how much of this content is going to be procedurally generated versus handcrafted. One of the big talking points after the reveal were how people are almost frustrated with those 1,000 planets and would rather 10 handmade ones. And although I think the gameplay reveal did a pretty bad job at showcasing some of that, and that's why there were so many concerns, a lot of the quotes you've been getting after the fact are doing a great job at making me feel very confident in this game.
It's about your ability to write your own story within the story that Starfield is, and your ability to ask questions, seek for their answers, and maybe get them.
And I think that quote gets a bit more into that, into Starfield as a handcrafted experience, and really describes Starfield as almost a true role-playing sandbox. We've heard in the past how Starfield's main story will be about 20% longer than Fallout 4 and Skyrim.
It might be 20% more than our previous ones, but if our previous ones, if we aimed for, let's say, a 25-hour main quest, this one might be in the 30s, maybe 40 just for the main quest.
And although the core story will be a comparable size, the game itself will seemingly be much larger, as Starfield will feature over 200,000 lines of dialogue and no voiced protagonist. That is more lines of dialogue than both Skyrim and Fallout 4 combined. And of course, Fallout 4 had a voiced protagonist, which was a lot of Fallout 4's dialogue. So I think this quote from Anon Zur about being able to make your own story, coupled with the immense amount of dialogue in this game, is actually pretty telling. It seems like there's going to be a lot of divergent paths for us to explore and unique experience we can have based on what we do or where we go. How we build out our character may really define certain aspects of this game. On one hand, there's going to be a ton of those procedurally generated features, going to planets, setting up settlements, ship customization, ship flying, ship combat, but also a lot of options to go out there, ask questions, and get answers dependent on who we are and how we fit into this universe overall. Seems like Starfield will be one of those games where you could follow the main story, and that'll almost be the more unrailed section of the game. It'll introduce you to some of the new features, but the core of the game, the real fun aspects, are going to be when you go off that main story and have your own experiences outside of it. But speaking of the story, Anon talks a bit about this as well.
Starfield is a huge game. Starfield is a deep game. It's a philosophical game. It's a game that will consume a lot of, if you want to play Starfield, it'll consume a lot of your being. I believe that after Starfield, you will be a bit of, I wouldn't say like changed person, but it will definitely give you another perspective, maybe deeper perspective to your whole being. Starfield really takes a very courageous step into realm of that is more philosophical.
I feel like this is one of the most interesting quotes to come up around Starfield, at least to me. We know Starfield is going to be getting into some serious topics. Politics have been talked about by Todd Howard. We have two wildly different major factions that apparently have an uneasy peace. The ultra-modernized United Colonies versus the more frontiersman Freestar Collective. You can see how they'll have wildly different ideologies, and depending on what you feel and you believe, it'll be reflected on your choices around these two factions. We know the game's going to have several religions, and religion will be a topic coming out throughout the main game. Getting into the philosophical side of futuristic religions will definitely be an interesting component. But of course, the biggest one is that question of humanity's greatest mystery, which apparently we're tracking down. And we technically don't actually actually know what humanity's greatest mystery is. Many people speculate it's either the origins of life or what else is out there, and you can definitely see how this could get pretty interesting, with Starfield focusing more on the serious and philosophical. To me, taking this quote with everything else we know, it really seems like Starfield could be one of those games where you have choice and consequence around morally gray options. Not necessarily a clear-cut good guy and bad guy, but genuinely hard decisions that will make you evaluate your own values. The best example I could think of with Bethesda getting more philosophical was Far Harbor, questioning the nature of your own reality, and to me that was done incredibly well. I think most people agree Far Harbor is the best of Fallout 4. So hearing all of this about Starfield gets me very excited. It makes me really curious about what kind of questions we'll be asking ourselves and be asked more promptly in the game, but also the vast amount of interactions we will inevitably have in Starfield. Overall, this is a great interview, if not a bit of a shorter one, although there's only a couple of core quotes here. I feel like they're very telling at the same time, really getting into what it'll be like as we experience and explore Starfield.